So, Amir. I had the possibility of having a quick talk with Amir before this event. Of course, you can read a lot of things about Amir on the internet, also see some documentaries, but I think what he told me personally is interesting because it's something that you guys can't read. So one question I asked him was, how did a guy that was born in England, 1988, come to blockchain, and how was he interested in Bitcoin? And this is the story. So he went to school, and after school he tried to go to university. Well, he went to university, but he went 3 times and quit after a week, 3 times, because he realized it wasn't something for him. And after that he joined an open source company, which he worked on for 5 years, and things didn't go out, not because they weren't technically possible, they weren't technically good enough, let's say, to make this work, but because there were internal policies and internal problems. And so after that he became a professional poker player for 2 years. And so he did this for 2 years every day, and after 2 years he realized, this is not making me happy, this is not fulfilling me. And he also realized that the companies that were doing these poker playing things, that they earned a lot of money while doing it. And so his idea was to have this open source poker tournament. And so he looked at a couple of ideas, he stumbled across a few different cryptocurrencies, and he also saw Bitcoin, and he said back then, I mean in 2010, he looked at the website and it was, I mean, he thought, yeah, sure, peer-to-peer with no banks involved, not possible. I'm going to throw this one out. And since all the others weren't good either, he then again focused on Bitcoin, and so that's when the whole thing started. And so Bitcoin, and at the same time Anarchist, I think that's something that Ian mentioned that's very right about Amir too. I mean, blockchainers, and especially Amir, is a different thinker. He hasn't studied, but at the same time he did his own development. He read a lot, and he also fought in Syria against ISIS. I mean, it's a very, very interesting and adventurous life that he's had. And I think it'll be very interesting to hear what he's going to say. And I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about Bitcoin and maybe how this is compatible with his beliefs. But yes, so just welcome Amir, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you for having me here. I believe that ideas play a key role in shaping human history. And in particular, I want to talk about how technology has been shaped by key ideas, and how certain mechanical ideas of technology, certain mechanical ideas of human society got mixed up with politics and technology. And what I want to talk about is a story of the free technology movement. It was a movement that had a lot of promise, with a lot of will and momentum behind it, with the idea at the heart of it that we could construct a radically different kind of society that never before in the human history was possible. And this movement was really influenced by the early visions of the early scientists and technologists who believed that this power of technology was not just for industry and military, but that it's for everybody in the society to be able to gain access to this power. And this movement, influenced by the early counterculture movement in the 60s, went on to develop the first personal computers. But that's not the end of the story. Because this vision of society mutated into the idea of building self-regulating systems which see human beings as objects managed by computer algorithms. And in this vision of society, the value of human ideas to transform the world was diminished in favor of creating self-regulating systems that just keep everybody happy. And now we find ourselves in a strange, static kind of dream world where now dark forces are threatening to penetrate back into our reality, and all of the dreams of the techno-utopists have played a role in constructing this fake world where human beings, driven by their desire, devoid of all sense of higher purpose, become slaves to algorithms and vast computer intelligences. So what was interesting about this story is that we now find ourselves at the end point of a movement that at one point showed a huge amount of potential to change and to transform society. But when faced with the complexity of trying to understand this world that we're living in, instead withdrew with no idea about where to go next. So facing our growing irrelevance as a hacker movement, as a free software movement, our group is here to revitalize the free technology movement. And what we want to do is we want to put forward a vision that can bring back the potential of technology to transform human society. And what we will be doing is training the next generation of revolutionary hackers dedicated to using technology to shape human society. So in this speech as well, I'm going to reference a place called Rojava, Rojava. It's a place in North Syria with a population of 5 million people, following an anarchist philosophy called democratic confederalism. And it is one of the most important global developments since the collapse of the Twin Towers. And at the heart of this story lies two figures called B.F. Skinner and Lewis Mumford. And that was a moment when two really key ideas about how society should be formed first started to take hold. But to understand this conflict, we first have to go back to the original development of computers in the 1800s with two figures called Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage. And this was a time of industrialism and science. And it was a time when these two people first started to put together ideas that today underlie modern computers. So Charles Babbage, he was a guy that was working on industrial problems. And what he first did is to construct a machine that could solve a wide variety of industrial problems. And as he began to tweak and to modify the machine, he started to realize that he could actually generalize this machine, not just to solve a few problems, but to solve any problems. So what he created was the world's first general-purpose computer. And his main collaborator was a woman called Ada Lovelace. Her father was Lord Byron, the poet, and he had gone to fight against the Ottomans for the Greek War of Independence, and he had died in that conflict, and her mother was very bitter towards her father, and she refused Ada to study science and mathematics, to study poetry and arts, and pushed Ada into studying maths, science, and logic. And Ada was really passionately interested in like a wide variety of mathematical science and technology fields. And what she really believed is that mathematics fundamentally was a creative field that depended on imagination and intuition. And she called her approach poetical science. And Charles Babbage, on the other hand, he was really inspired by the industrial factories of the time. One of his other main contributions was to economics, was a way of increasing efficiency from the workers in the factory. So, whereas Ada, on the other hand, she was really interested in metaphysical questions, transforming social reality, and understanding the world that she was living in. And what really fascinated Ada about Babbage's computer was the social potentiality that it held. And what Ada did was to make a really big conceptual leap, because what she realized is that the numbers inside the computer could be used to represent symbols like letters, musical notes, or works of graphics, and that this computer could have symbolic rules for transforming these symbols. And what Ada did was she wrote the world's first computer program, and her mindset led her to ask questions about the role of the individual in relation to society and technology. But unfortunately, Babbage constantly argued with the engineers. He constantly tried to perfect his design, and his vision of a computer never got built. And it would take another 100 years before the first computers would emerge during World War II, and it would take 150 years before Ada's vision of a computer in every home would become a reality. So during World War II, the first computers started to emerge, and these were gigantic machines that were used to calculate ballistics for missiles or to crack German war codes. And these were huge, centralized machines that reflected the military in which they were designed for. And even as they started to spread out from military into industry, they still remained highly centralized machines controlled by a big bureaucracy, a big elite group of people. And one of those early computer scientists working on the computers was a guy called Donald Mickey. Donald Mickey was a colleague of Alan Turing, Alan Turing is known as the father of artificial intelligence and computer science. And Donald Mickey, he had also worked to crack German code ciphers during World War II. After the war, he went to work on artificial intelligence. And at the time, artificial intelligence was heavily influenced by the thoughts of Alan Turing. And what we have to understand about Alan Turing, it was a guy that was socially withdrawn, and he had tried to understand the human mind by developing mathematical, mechanical models that explained human thought and reason. And at the same time, it was the 50s in America. There was a huge amount of technological optimism. Buckminster Fuller was designing futuristic homes. There was an exhibit of Futurama all around America showing the future cities, and everybody was being told that by the 90s we'd be living on the moon. And so AI experienced a huge boom in development. However, during the 60s, development of AI had started to stagnate. And a lot of the earlier predictions that people had been making about artificial intelligence actually turned out to be false. So Donald Mickey, he was originally a biologist. He had trained as a biologist before he had decided that he wanted to dedicate himself to AI. And what he did was to pioneer a new approach in artificial intelligence, which combined the dominant ideas of symbolic logic based off of replicating the human mind through reason and theory, which originally came from Alan Turing, and new ideas about human mind based on interpretation, experimental science, and cognitive psychology. So Donald Mickey's main idea was to combine all of these approaches because he saw the pure focus on logic as the main reason why AI development had stopped. But Donald Mickey actually went a lot further because what he also did is he stated that although we could use artificial intelligence to solve some really difficult problems, we also must understand how and why artificial intelligence is solving certain problems. And he called this super-articulacy. He emphasized that it wasn't just important for AI to solve problems, but also to explain how and why they solved certain problems. And that intelligence also gives meaning to its action. So Donald Mickey, he also made a prophetic speech in which he said that this new emerging computer technology had the power or the potential to liberate humanity or to bring untold amounts of human suffering. And that it depended on how we as humans chose to employ this technology. So this brings us, in the story, to the clash between B.F. Skinner and Lewis Mumford, and between the behavioral psychologists in 1968, who the behavioral psychologists believed in using science to manage society, and the utopian idealists who wanted to liberate humanity from power. So in the mid-60s, there was a BBC documentary called Towards Tomorrow, in which it presented different possible future visions for humanity. So one of these visions was B.F. Skinner's vision. And B.F. Skinner said that with the decline of old forms of authority, how could we organize the masses in a future human society? So his vision of a society was a society managed by an elite group of technocrats where human beings are constantly monitored to keep them passive and to keep them happy. So what Skinner proposed was a new way of order to control people. And he argued that in this age of individualism and mass democracy, old forms of coercion are no longer possible. And so what he proposed was a system based off of reward. So in the documentary, it first shows an experiment, and pigeons are trained to peck a correct symbol on a button in return for a pellet of food. So the pigeons, in effect, become mechanical objects in order that they gain a reward. And he took this even further. In a mental hospital in San Bernardino, California, mental patients were given a reward for the correct social behavior. So if the patients obeyed authority and followed the rules, they get given a paper currency. And with this paper currency, at lunchtime, they can sit on a dinner table with a nice tablecloth and eat in a better conditions. And if they didn't have this paper money, then they have to eat in less elegant conditions. So what Skinner created in that mental hospital was a new ordered system of hierarchy from a system of social reward. So one in which the human beings, they don't feel like they're controlled, they feel empowered. So Skinner tells us that he sees this as the future of humanity. And what is really fascinating about this is eerily similar to what we live in today, where there is a technocratic elite that manages society and has no interest in politics and only manages us to keep us happy and make themselves rich. And that a lot of this was funded in the 80s with the fake consumer credit boom to reward us like the mental hospital patients. So Lewis Mumford, he puts forward an alternative vision. And in this video, he first criticizes Skinner, and then he puts forward an alternative vision where we're all active participants in society deciding our destiny. There's no sound. Okay. Yeah, perfect.
Skinner has a very ingenious way of making a system of highly compulsive organizations seem as though it were a very humane one. This is his great and original contribution. The old-fashioned mechanical collectives, the mega machines, as I call them, were brutal. They used punishment as a way of enforcing conformity. Skinner and the psychological school that he represents have found a much better system than punishment. They first tried it out on animals, and now they're applying it to human beings. Reward them. Make them do exactly what you want them to do without the whip, but with some form of sugar-coated drug or candy, which will make them think that they're actually enjoying every moment of it. This is the most dangerous of all systems of compulsion. That's why I regard Skinner's Walden 2 as another name for hell. And it would be a worse hell because we wouldn't realize we were there. We would imagine that we're still in heaven. Most of the reactions that have taken place in art, including those that come under the head of the beatniks and the hippies, have some underlying sense in the reaction itself. But the remedy is part of the disease. The remedy, in fact, makes it easier for the institutions that now have their hold upon us to be even more compulsive and even more effective than ever before. If we don't care, if we drop out, if we lose ourselves in insane fantasy of some kind, whether a natural fantasy of the neurotic or the chemically induced fantasy of someone who takes drugs, we lose our possibility of restoring our own autonomy, of taking charge of our life, because this requires greater energy, greater effort than that which is required to live through the daily life of a machine worker. We have to become fully activated human beings, every part of us, tremendously alive and ready to take charge. And this can't be done by people who are in escape, people who are who form the habit of total rejection. We must know what we want, not just what we don't want.
Mumford was a philosopher of technologist and a utopian idealist who believed that technology did not develop on a straight path. And he wrote books where he compared symbolism in modern technological inventions with ancient monuments to explain how these ideas from the ancient world were deeply woven into the DNA of modern science and technology. And what he proposed, Mumford, is that we had to use technology to develop a new form of society which restored back the autonomy to human beings, which had been lost by what he termed the mega machine. And he called for a study of technology to free humanity and create an organic modernity, which he termed polytechnics. So at the same time, during the 60s, the hacker movement was being birthed. So computers were still large, centralized machines controlled by a bureaucracy, but they had slowly begun to move away from military into the hands of industry. And in this environment, small groups of people believed that this new power had the potential to advance humanity, and they became obsessed with gaining the fruit of this knowledge. So many of them started to get low-level jobs near these computers as technicians or even janitors, where they were able to gain access to these instruments of power and become familiar with their inner workings. So they would wait for a missed appointment on the machine, that they could jump onto the machine, they could use the computers, and they could become familiar with them in those spare moments. And they began to develop their own code. They began to share it in a community. They began to share the knowledge between each other, meeting in person. And slowly, slowly, in garages, in homes, in universities, they began to develop their own computers. And this is what led to the development of the personal computer. So this was a collaborative, idealistic community that really believed that they could use computer technology to change the world and improve humanity. And they are the reason why today we have computers, laptops, and telephones. So as the potential of these new computers started to become apparent, a lot of investment companies saw a really big opportunity. And a lot of capital started to flow into this community of people that previously were very marginalized. And as a lot of new business ventures started to be formed, the culture of this community also began to change drastically. So whereas before, values of collaboration, sharing knowledge, and idealism played like a really central role, the new companies instead sought efficiency, profit, and growth. So this was something that was really important for developing the computer into a usable product that we can use. But in the process of this transformation, something very important was being lost. So whereas before, hackers, they would work to empower humanity and share code between themselves, the new technology companies started to close off the technology from each other, started to restrict access to the code, and stop to share the knowledge with each other. And so in their rush towards money, the hackers lost sight of what gave them strength as a community. But not all of the hackers went along with the changes. And one young hacker called Richard Stallman resented what he saw happening in the hacker community. So in this video, he explains his philosophy and his background.
My project is to make all software free. Computers are sort of a fascinating build-it set where you can build things that you can then use to build more things.
What you're building is kind of alive. It has a life of its own. It's a little thing that follows all your commands.
It allows you to put together structures that you couldn't have put together before and carry this on until you're making structures thousands of times as big. I'd get up around 5 or so and come into the lab, read the messages people would send me. Then I'd go out to Chinatown with people and have a nice dinner. Then I'd come back and I would write programs all night, and around 7 in the morning I'd go to sleep.
Richard Stallman has been called the last pure hacker for choosing to remain at MIT despite the temptations of the commercial world, true to the spirit of the early hackers.
What they had in common was mainly love of excellence in programming. They wanted to make their programs that they used be as good as they could. They also wanted to make them do neat things. They wanted to be able to do something in a more exciting way than anyone believed possible and show, look how wonderful this is. I bet you didn't believe this could be done.
Philosophical phone freaks and early hackers believed that information and tools should be free, or at least available to serious seekers, and they openly shared their work with others. Some argue that the computer revolution could not have happened without that hacker ethic. Today, hackers are divided between the old values and the new. They can't agree whether source codes, the basic blueprints of a program, should be shared or not.
Hackers frequently want to look at code, like operating system listings and the like, to learn how it was done before them, because this is how they're going to learn to do it. And source should be made available reasonably to those sort of people, not to copy, not to sell, but to learn from. Tools I will give away to anybody, but the product, that's my soul is in that product. I don't want anyone fooling with that. I don't want anyone hacking into that product and changing it, because then it won't be mine.
Imagine if you bought a house and the basement was locked and only the original building contractor had the key. If you needed to make any change, repair anything, you had to go to him. And if he was too busy doing something else, he'd tell you to get lost and you'd be stuck.
It's like somebody saying, looking at a painting and saying, well, I don't like that color over there, so I'll just take a can of paint and change it. That wrecks the whole painting. Okay, that changes everything that I did. And that to me is one of the greatest insults.
You're at that person's mercy, and you become downtrodden and resigned. That's what happens when the blueprints to a computer program are kept secret by the organization that sells it. And that's the usual way things are done.
Stallman set a really ambitious aim for the hackers to create a new free operating system, not owned by any company or organization, instead freely available for everybody. And nobody took him seriously. Besides being massively complex, it didn't seem to really make sense. Why would anybody spend years to develop an operating system which wasn't sold for profit? It seemed to raise more problems than it actually solved, and so Richard Stallman was ignored. But Stallman was very persistent in everything that he did. And he was not somebody that took no for an answer. And if he really believed in something, he would dedicate himself to it. And so for the next decade, he went and he wrote his operating system. And it took a lot of energy, but slowly he gained a small following, which grew larger over time. And the result of that was Linux, which is arguably one of the most important developments in the history of computing in the early 90s. And the early 90s saw a huge burst of energy again from the hackers. The free software movement was expanding. Crypto-anarchists were developing new ideas about money, and they were engaging in conflicts with power and the state. And this was also the age of the hack lab, where hackers were setting up underground hack labs to experiment with free technology. This community of people created their own technologies, which they used to communicate internationally through decentralized, uncensored networks, like the chat protocol IRC. And this was a communication system with different chat rooms where people could enter and discuss different topics. So for instance, when the Soviet Union fell, there was no access to radio, television, telephones, everything stopped. The only way that news was able to fly out of Moscow was through this chat protocol IRC. Hackers in Moscow were giving information about the events happening to the rest of the world. So at the same time, the ideas of Lewis Mumford had started to grow into their own body of ideas. And so one of these people that was influenced by these new ideas was the leader of a guerrilla organization fighting against the Turkish state called Abdullah Öcalan. So his group in 1984 had started an armed campaign for Kurdish rights, and it started as a nationalistic communist group. But as he and other people in the organization started to see the amount of horror that they unleashed, the tens of thousands of people on both sides were killed, there began a movement for a demand for cultural rights and democratization of the centralized Turkish state. In 1999, Öcalan was captured, and he was imprisoned as the sole prisoner on an island in Turkey, guarded by over 1,000 soldiers, where he remains to this day. And while he was on that island, he started to study many different authors, And he started to piece together a new theory of anarchism called democratic confederalism. So one of these authors that heavily influenced Öcalan was a guy called Moray Bookchin. And Moray Bookchin had based his ideas off of Lewis Mumford and his writings on technology. And Bookchin had been rejected by the anarchists in the 90s for criticizing them, for saying that the anarchists were not a serious revolutionary movement, but a bunch of people living a lifestyle. So here is a video by Bookchin talking about why communism failed.
Got another word.
No, Stillman.
Second World War, and particularly by the end of the 1940s, I literally saw this movement disappear, and disappear from history, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And I have no belief whatever that it will come back again. Namely, what I'm saying is, I saw the end of the classical workers' movement. And I had to ask myself, why had this come about? What did this mean? And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before it united with the AFFL, when it was still in a very militant, stage of its development. That this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. That in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served in fact to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views. Because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups.
So Öcalan advanced his ideology of democratic confederalism, which is a really big step forwards for the anarchist movement. And he is a really great thinker, and his writings are the most important of this century. At the same time, during the late 90s, the web started to take off and first started to become popular. And companies saw another opportunity. After the early boom of the computers, this time around, everybody was determined not to miss this opportunity to get rich. But there is very little understanding about what the web actually was, or even how companies could make money from it. And the dot-com boom turned into a dot-com bubble as business venture after business venture started to go bankrupt. And at the same time, Stallman's movement had grown, but Stallman had missed the opportunity to turn it into organized and funded movement. So while Stallman's ideas had inspired many people to devote themselves to the cause, there was no organized structure to facilitate this growing movement. And so a new group of people started to emerge, and they attempted a coup on Stallman's movement, free software movement. And they were really keen to attract business interests and present themselves as the clean face of the free software movement. They started a rigorous branding campaign, renaming free software to open source. And they made a lot of dubious claims about that open source had actual business benefits, such as being better quality and cheaper. That it wasn't a question of ethics and values, but it was a simple business equation. One of the main thinkers of this movement was a man called Raymond. And unlike Richard Stallman's hippie politics and talk of sharing, Raymond believed in American values and individualism. And one of his main books was a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which presented open source software development as an open marketplace with many spontaneous actors all acting in their own self-interest. And he coined the term scratching a personal itch. He used it to explain that programmers worked on open source software, not because they wanted to solve a personal problem that they experienced. And so Raymond is also known for the phrase that given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. And so the argument goes basically like this. When you have thousands of people participating in a software project, all giving a small contribution of time, then it becomes inevitable that the bugs will get found and fixed. So, whereas the older idea of groups of hackers united by an idea, developing technology to challenge power, spread their values, was now replaced by a new idea of spontaneous individuals, all working in their own self-interest to write open source software. So it was the idea that we could create networks of rational, self-motivated individuals, free from power, outside the constraints of politics. And so what happened is that the hacker movement submitted to the same power complex of the system that it originally aimed to fight against. And it lost the power that it once had to use technology to shape the world. After the year 2000, with the collapse of the Twin Towers, with resource conflicts and Islamic terrorism, the technology world, rather than directly confronting politics and power, instead preferred to withdraw into constructing dream worlds. And that the technology world became driven by the idea of individuals spontaneously pursuing their own personal interests rather than groups of people driven through a shared vision and a sense of ambition. And what happened is that we allowed our legacy to be absorbed by the state and into serving power. And in this new world we created, anybody could be whoever they wanted to be, free from power. But in actual fact, what we had created was an illusion that allowed power to cloak itself with technology, making reality less tangible for people to grasp. It first began in the 90s with a lawyer named Peter Thiel. And he had lost money when the dot-com bubble burst, and he was determined for it not to happen again. Peter Thiel started a software company to build a cryptographic payment system called Confinity. It was influenced by the earlier ideas that had existed on the internet from the crypto-anarchists, and it turned Peter Thiel into a billionaire. So this product would later be renamed PayPal. Peter Thiel became a heroic figure in Silicon Valley, and he liked to present himself as a libertarian hero from an Ayn Rand novel, and he funded Seasteading Institute and libertarian think tanks with the money that he made, and he became a really well-sought-out thinker by heads of industry, and he won many awards. However, beneath Thiel's veneer, there is a deep cynicism and a mistrust of ethics. In 2005, a document was leaked to TechCrunch, and it revealed that one of Peter Thiel's lesser-known companies, called Palantir, was providing advanced analysis and networking infrastructure for US intelligence agencies. As TechCrunch explained, the US spy agencies also employed Palantir to connect databases across departments. Before this, most of the databases used by the CIA and FBI were siloed, forcing users to search each database individually. Now everything is linked together using Palantir. When Mark Zuckerberg, inspired by IRC and other earlier social networks, started to build Facebook to connect people, Peter Thiel was there from the beginning as one of the main investors steering the project. He was also an investor for the depoliticized hack lab of Silicon Valley called Y Combinator, which is early funder of Coinbase, one of the signers of the New York Bitcoin Agreement, and he was also an early funder for Ethereum. So what is important to realize is that technology and how it grows is deeply influenced by the people where that technology originates from and what they believe. During the post-2000 era, there was a wave of optimism followed by the failed revolutions of the pirates, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street. And it was here that Wikipedia emerged as a really ambitious project to compile the sum of all human knowledge. So Wikipedia was influenced by an earlier idea from Raymond and the open source movement of large groups of people coming together, all making a small contribution to build large-scale projects. And at first, it remained small, but as the project expanded and became known, it grew very quickly. And the idea seemed to work. It seemed to validate the earlier open source idea of managing people with decentralized systems. New prophets of the Wikipedia revolution started to emerge. People started to write books and organize conferences and talk about the magic of what they call commons-based peer production. But then something strange happened. Wikipedia released statistics on the project. And when people began to analyze the data, the reality we saw didn't fit our expectations. What we saw is that most of the articles written in Wikipedia were written by a small group of editors that spent hours every day working on Wikipedia. And what this showed was that Wikipedia is not written by large groups of people, all spontaneously contributing one or two sentences. What we actually saw is that Wikipedia was written by a small core of dedicated people who spent the vast majority of their time on Wikipedia, and that what brought these people together was an idea that drives them towards a vision. And we see the same thing in open source projects. There is always a core of developers driven by the project's vision. No open source project, in my own personal experience, was driven by a mass of developers all working for their own self-benefit. The saying, given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, is false. Software is a vastly complex enterprise that requires a huge level of coordination, hard work, and creative thinking based off of real understanding and knowledge. Developers do not spend years of their life to write software because they want to solve a small personal itch or problem that occupies themselves. Developers are driven through a sense of ambition, the ability to influence the world, to craft something meaningful, and the satisfaction of making a good work. Many of our original ideas were full of huge potential, but they have been absorbed by power into serving its own interests. Why has this happened? What is important to realize is that what drove these projects was not some new technique or new feature. It was groups of people driven by a vision, exploring ideas and possibilities to try and realize it. Bitcoin itself has a long history that goes back to the roots of the crypto-anarchist movement as a political invention. It's clear now that our movement needs new ideas that can bring people together towards a vision. But we must not limit ourselves to technology and become fixated on creating products to fill the spaces in the environment around us. We must think on a big scale. We need to think globally, making an effort to understand the political context of the here and the now, and how we apply technology to influence the world around us. Our organization is a group of revolutionary hackers focused on the global struggle for revolution, for a libertarian society, what we call the democratic nation. And we are a part of the emerging democratic confederalist movement. This Western system of managed stability has turned into lurching from crisis to crisis without any vision of where we're heading towards as a civilization. This Western system has exhausted its potential to advance humanity forwards. Breaking out of this cage, new idealistic movements are forming, such as the New Right and ISIS, in the gaps among this global breakup of power. Western society has grown comfortable, emphasizing the sensory world of comfort, pleasure, and fame, with very little creative thought to the ideas that drive society and culture. We are erased from our roots, constantly breaking with the past to impose a new, superior model in a thirstless drive for efficiency. We are disconnected from space and time. We have a politics based off of abstract models that disregard geography and history. Art relies more and more on a frenzied emphasis of the new and the shocking, on sensationalism, while religion, stripped of its substance, is tending towards fundamentalism. Everything is constantly changing, while economics and politics has become blindly hedonistic and utilitarian, enslaving humans inside a hierarchical, mechanistic, state-based system. This system has exhausted itself. It is the final days of Rome. And what's happening in Rojava is the source of an ideological movement advancing the legacy of anarchism, and there are many movements now emerging, and Rojava will be one source of change that is going to spread throughout the world. For instance, now in Catalonia, the party in a municipality in Barcelona and many other cities in Catalonia is based off of the political program of Rojava, of democratic confederalism and the ideas of Murray Bookchin of libertarian municipalism. And now in Latin America, new groups are forming that are organizing around these ideas and studying them. And we are at the start of another era in global history. And the groups that are taking root now will be vying for power amongst the dissipation of the liberal world order. So democratic confederalists are one of these movements, and it is our work now to lay down the foundation so our later struggles will be a success. Right now, the technology world is too focused on capital and products, and what we actually need are ideological hackers. Trained revolutionary hackers that are ready to serve as the forefront of this change as the prophets carrying a message, able to comprehend the world and to organize larger groups of people towards a shared vision. And to this end, we are establishing a training academy in Barcelona to train a core group of politicized revolutionary hackers that will be responsible for organizing a new network of technologists. And we are in a stage now of forming important key concepts to advance the hacker movement forwards. And in particular, what we want to do is we want to make a synthesis of the ideas of the crypto-anarchists, the free software movement, the hackers, and other great thinkers, and into a new area of study for how we apply these techniques to advance our goal of spreading democratic confederalism. And to this goal, we are reviving the field of study first proposed by the great thinker Lewis Mumford, who named this polytechnics. Technics is concerned with coming into being. That is, thinking and acting how something may come into being, which can either exist or not exist, and whose origin is in the creator, not simply in the product itself. Polytechnics is about applying our knowledge of techniques for the construction of a new democratic modernity, a free, autonomous humanity, and restoring back the organic synthesis of nature with civilization. And what we do is we instrumentalize techniques to further our goals. And for us to be successful, we need to have a full comprehension of the true meaning of freedom, hierarchy, and state. And one of our starting points is the revolution in Rojava, which we see as a stepping stone to further opportunities internationally. And we want to advance new concepts to do with cryptographic law, decentralized economy, digital governance, and free technology. And this is an ideological movement. It is setting down its roots internationally and will continue to spread. And we, as hackers, are taking our place to build the technical arm of this revolutionary movement. We are not just hackers, but we're missionaries of an idea, training more hackers to replace us and to grow as a movement. The first phase of our long-term strategic plan is to work on free software, telecommunications networks, and Bitcoin cryptographic projects. when Ethereum was first released, one of the main projects was literally advertised as unstoppable code and raised $150 million, becoming the highest crowdfunded project in the history of the internet. But that's not the end of the story, because it was hacked and it lost $50 million. Ethereum itself had to change its unmutable code to reverse this human error. And what we should have realized then is we aren't just working with technology, but with people and ideas that shape them. And now, Bitcoin and the wider free technology movement suffers now from a crisis of confidence after a series of open confrontations. And that the task now is for us to understand the underlying cause of this division is not because of some technical things, but it's because of the underlying ideology of the people involved in the project itself. And that the way forwards for resolving this series of conflicts is not some new form of management or a new bureaucratic process inside of Bitcoin, but a real synthesis and restoration of values back to the project. Even the developers of Bitcoin themselves should be trained ideologically so that the project gains a coherency towards a shared vision. And that any structure that we make is only as good as the ethical values of the people inside of that structure. The main role of technology is not shaping the external world to coerce people to act in a certain way, but to support an ideology that can change the internal world of people's thoughts. Richard Stallman, he didn't just write an alternative operating system that replaced the proprietary operating systems. He gave us a vision and a long-term goal for us to work towards. He wrote articles and made speeches which inspired thousands of hackers to join his cause. Stallman inspired me through his ideas and action. Stallman is a prophet who spoke about power and technology decades ago. He predicted that our current path would lead to vast corporate and state intelligence apparatuses that wield huge amounts of power over technology users. While what Stallman proposed was taking back control of technology through a movement that sought to technologically empower its users. Wait for that to pass. All right. So we're here now to find allies and fellow travelers who are in this cause with us, to find people who want to fund us, people who want to work with us, and people who have places to work. Never before in the history of modernity have we had an opportunity like this to break free. And we're entering a new tipping point where history now is bifurcating after a long period of stability. We're moving into a global breakup of power and a rapid multiplication of ideologies and a shift in the geopolitical balance that is opening up gaps in governance around the world. Humanity itself is facing a future with a huge amount of suffering and conflict. There is no happy future awaiting us, but a dark period of hardship followed by a period of regeneration. However, it is also an opportunity for revolutionaries that are well prepared to take advantage of this coming crisis and steer it towards their own vision. And not everybody can be a revolutionary because it takes commitment, sacrifice, discipline, and dedicating yourself to a cause beyond yourself. To be points of change, able to fight, we must achieve self-mastery and reach our self-potential as human beings. And very few people have that kind of courage to give up everything and to pursue history. But those that walk with us in these early days will reach their destiny, and every human being has a divine purpose. But you choose whether to walk that path or not. And whether you choose to strive towards your goal and grab it, or to remain down on earth chasing the things that distract you from your path. Hackers have withdrawn into a bubble and separated ourselves from the real problems of this world. We are playing a game with the system. Just look at some of the topics that, well, not in this conference, but in another conference, that are more about comfort and self-indulgence rather than changing the world and influencing global politics. Hackers used to shape the world. We were a powerful force. We were a force that exerted our will onto the world. Now we have withdrawn into making toys, and trinkets to amuse ourselves. So what happened to that will and ambition for greatness? And it's even worse than that, because our dreams have mutated into nightmares. And unless this movement has a big change, all of the efforts of our forefathers, of the crypto-anarchists, of the free software movement, and the hackers will amount to nothing. Everything will fail and dissipate, because now the world is in the midst of a huge global shift. And we are not engaging with this change. We have become depoliticized vessels of emptiness, dazzled by lights of modernity. So, for instance, this year in the UK, there was a general election, and while all of the main parties talked about the two most important issues facing UK society, terrorism and immigration, the Pirate Party instead talked about copyright reform and libel law. Are we going to confine ourselves to irrelevance, or are we going to try and apply our knowledge towards something useful? We live in a technological society, and technology is another front in the struggle for freedom. We are facing in the West a deep social crisis. This is not simply an economic crisis. No new economic or political model is going to save us. Neither will some new innovation or technology. The huge level of mental disorders are a symptom of the destruction of humanity. That part of the humanity in the West is dying, subjugated to this mechanistic industrial system of enslavement that started with building pyramids and has ended with nuclear weapons. But there are signs that the system has exhausted its capability to manage the crisis any longer. New movements are rising up to exploit the vacuum, and all of us will be forced to pick sides. The baby boomers, they tried to remain neutral, but instead they became victims of power and domination. And technology is an instrument that hackers wield. And we need a vision that gives us meaning and direction. So our group is one of the most exciting technology projects in the world right now, at the forefront of history. And we are Autonomous Polytechnics Group. Freedom, anarchy, technics. Yeah, I've finished.
I think this one will work. Okay. Well, Amir, thank you. Very interesting talk. I think it's something definitely that we can all think about. I mean, it's a different side of Bitcoin, completely different side, but I think he also showed that Anarchist and Bitcoin is definitely compatible. I mean, it's the idea behind Bitcoin in the end. And thank you for the talk and for the interesting insights into the development of Bitcoin. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now, as promised, we have time for questions. We have 2 microphones. Do you want to go to the back? Not too many. Yeah, but I promised it this time. Yeah, so we'll just go for it. Lucas is in the back. Just raise your hand. I can see one in the back. So just ask your questions. 1 question, please. Thank you.
So hello. So you mentioned the motivation of all the hackers, which is more like working towards a vision, very intrinsic, having a common goal and stuff like this. But isn't like the whole Bitcoin thing a little bit sort of like extrinsic, motivated by money, and not so much in congruence with the values of the hackers, which should be more like intrinsic?
All of the people that were involved in Bitcoin from the very early days of its development didn't expect Bitcoin to explode so quickly. I made a 10-year plan for Bitcoin. After 2 years, after 5 years, after 8 years, this will be the value of Bitcoin. And that 8 years actually happened in about 4 months. So from that early days, we were dedicating ourselves to a project that we didn't expect to pay out in any near term whatsoever. A lot of the people that were involved in Bitcoin were idealists. And still, to this day, the actual people who are driving Bitcoin forwards, they could earn a lot more money working in industry, giving their expertise, but they choose to apply their knowledge to very hard, intractable problems, very specialist problems that only a small group of people dedicate themselves to. And that's what really holds Bitcoin together as a project. And these people don't get paid a lot of money. They should be getting a lot more money. And even some of the main wallets that people use in Bitcoin, like Electrum, they're volunteer projects. They're not well funded. So there's a disconnect between companies that raise huge amounts of capital and the actual projects that drive the project forwards. Both of these are important. I'm not rejecting one or the other, but there has to be a synthesis between them. And that was what I was trying to get at in the talk with Richard Stallman. He had the opportunity to turn his movement into something bigger, but he missed that opportunity. And so it got overtaken by business interests, and then the project lost its potential. And that's the risk that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency projects face. If we don't realize how to use the capital to drive the idealism that is at the center of these projects, then these projects will lose their ability to shape the world around us.
Hi, thanks for the talk. If you think about the block size increase as a technical sort of hot button topic where there's some goal you could optimize for, the hacker community has not been particularly good at coming together and not being strongly opinionated about such a technical topic. Like we have I don't know how many forks out there now for a block size increase. How could you see that this technical community becomes less strongly opinionated on something that's more up in the air, like a ethical vision? I have very little hope for the technical community to come together and argue with itself in a way that comes together as a shared vision. That seems like a bit hard for a community that has not been particularly good at engaging with each other. Do you have any recommendations on how to overcome this? Should we all be less strongly opinionated, or should we come up with some rules of discussion first so that we get this job done more quickly?
So what I was trying to get in the talk is that no new management process is going to solve that crisis. What that crisis is the problem with is everybody have a different ideology, a different set of values about what Bitcoin is about. What attracted me to Bitcoin when I saw it is something that said Bitcoin is peer-to-peer money that cannot be controlled by banks or central governments. That's something that spoke really clearly to me. What we have to understand is that in today's world, people work jobs they absolutely hate. They know has absolutely no meaning or purpose whatsoever. People work their whole lives to earn money, which is literally a number in a central bank that is controlled by a financial elite. That is a really sinister form of mass conscription of labor, of enslaving a population economically. The people dedicate their entire lives to earn money, which has no value whatsoever. So now, there are a lot of cryptocurrency projects, and everybody's going, oh yeah, we're going to make this thing, and we're going to make that thing. And when you really try to ask people, okay, but what is it that we're trying to do? People can't really give real-life use cases. They're like, yeah, well, we're going to find what it's going to be used for, but it's really cool. And that's what I meant by people getting dazzled by technology, by modernity. Rather than trying to understand what is the problems, like big problems facing society, and how we use the technology to in support of those goals. So Bitcoin, as a project, it's not about making payments smoother. It's not about having a new form of currency for rich Westerners. Bitcoin is a project about challenging the power of central banks, a power which is used to maintain a huge state apparatus system, a military-industrial complex, which enslaves the whole of humanity. The very sinister thing that we live under. That is the purpose of Bitcoin. So where does this debate come from? Well, there was one group of guys that they really believed that Bitcoin needs to get capital, needs to get accepted by the system, by financial industry, by big banks and governments and states. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to work with legislators to try and find ways to make Bitcoin to fit the legacy financial system. But what they didn't realize is that technology is a social system. Bitcoin is not an abstract object that exists in space, immutable. That's what I tried to show with the example of Ethereum. Ethereum had a project which advertised itself as code that was immutable, that it couldn't be changed. But then it got hacked, and they changed the code. And that was when we realized it's a social system. These are systems influenced by people inside of them. You have the miners, the developers, the users, many different groups of people. And they have ideologies that drive them. And it's undeniable that Bitcoin is driven by a free market ideology of wanting to liberate ourselves from the central banks. And this group of people, the Bitcoin Foundation, they say, okay, no, Bitcoin is a system, is incorruptible. Without seeing that, okay, no, by this process of assimilation, what we do is we allow Bitcoin as a system to evolve in a direction that it lose its core values as a project. It gain a different set of values. They thought that Bitcoin can go inside of the system, infect it from within, and change everything, without seeing that actually Bitcoin itself would change. And this other group of people are very committed to their ideals of Bitcoin as a tool to challenge the power of central banks. So that is where the block size debate came from one group of people who believed in Bitcoin as a tool, as a payments innovation. I mean, that's what the Bitcoin Foundation called their 2013 conference was Bitcoin, payments innovation. Versus another group of people who see it as a revolutionary tool to transform the human society, to increase human freedom. That's where that divide comes from. It's a difference in ideology, a difference in values. We need to understand, what is it that we're doing as a group of people? Not just do things randomly. We need to do it towards something. We need to have a long-term perspective, a long-term vision. And that vision needs to be connected to the world we live in.
First of all, thank you for your inspiring speech, but me as an economist, I absolutely understand that you're right. Bitcoin and other blockchain currency have the power to take the power away from central banks, from governments, etc. And I absolutely agree that it's necessary to do so. On this part, I'm totally right. But it doesn't show us history and various examples that it's very, very dangerous to take power, even from bad institutions, away as long as you don't have a clear vision what you want to replace it with. I mean, I can tell you... Why doesn't it work? Thousands of examples. If you see what happened in Iraq, replacing Saddam Hussein, I mean, obviously he was a very dangerous and also not a nice guy and not a good system. But what happened in Iraq, a civil war, I mean, you can take all these projects from Americans replacing bad, evil power and not replacing them on anything than a vacuum. I mean, if you're doing so, I mean, it's clear you can take the power away from the central banks, from the taxational part, all of this clearly, but what are you building? What is the vision behind you? What world do you want to build which can replace this power?
So in the talk I kept mentioning Rojava and Abdullah Öcalan and democratic confederalism. So this is an ideological movement because I'll give you two examples. What happened in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, a lot of activists suddenly mobilized with Facebook. They went to Tahrir Square and we're going to throw out the military dictatorship. And they threw out the military dictatorship. And then they sat down, okay, now what do we do? What's next? And, okay, we're going to have a discussion about it. And then in came a group of guys with an ideology, with a vision, that was able to pull enough people in the society behind them, and they took the power, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood. And then those same liberal activists came back and said, oh, shit. And then they went back to Tahrir Square, and this time they asked the military dictatorship to come back to rescue them from the Islamists. So the destruction of power without a corresponding ideological movement in the society to replace it is one of the key lessons of history. And that brings us to the example in Syria, where there was also a revolution, and there was a group of people, the PKK in Turkey, with an ideology of democratic confederalism from Öcalan, and they crossed over the border when the Syrian government imploded, and they were all able to organize the society economically in civilian structures, to organize their self-defense, to train them how to defend themselves, and they were able to maintain control of their region. And now that movement, Rojava, control the whole of North Syria, with a population of 5 million people, with an anarchist ideology of democratic confederalism, which is a big step forwards from anarchism, because anarchism have a really good vision of a society, but it doesn't give us the steps for how we get there. And the problem with anarchism is it has disconnected itself from a proper analysis of history and morality, just seeing like an abstract model for how we organize human society, becoming trapped inside of that same iron cage of Enlightenment thinking that has trapped liberalism, communism, fascism, all of the other major ideologies, which is why it doesn't have the ability to drive people to be able to shape the society. And that actually, what we do need to do is we do need to look at what are the different thoughts that are driving society today, what are the different ideologies and religions, to seek a new synthesis so we can have a path to be able to realize a free, autonomous humanity.
Thank you for your speech. I'm sure many people in the audience are wondering if we agree with your ideas, what's the next step we can take to learn more about your movement or to help you. For example, you mentioned some academy that you're starting in Barcelona. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, so I put my contact details on there, but the laptop, well, it was, if you go to amirtaaki.org, amirtaaki.org, I have my Signal contact and my email on there. If you, oh no, okay, amir@dyne.org is my email. And about this movement as well, if you go to Reddit, reddit.com/r/Rojava, ROJAVA, there's a link at the top if you want to understand democratic confederalism. You can click that link. It has a lot of information in there. What is important to realize is that now there are new emerging movements like Russia, like the New Right, like ISIS, also like the democratic confederalism, which is not just about, okay, what is the new structure that we're going to make to organize humans in the society, but what is the philosophy that we're going to spread in the society that's going to influence humans' behavior. It's the same in the same way that when Christianity came to Rome as an ideological movement, as a religious movement, based on a set of teachings that people became missionaries of, that they were carrying a message which they taught to other people, which they established churches to spread. There was something that spread within the Roman society through the personal sacrifice of people, and eventually ended up overtaking Rome. And in the period of the so-called Dark Ages, there were a lot of city-states. There wasn't really any strong centralized empire or state. But what brought coherency to the European society was a common guiding belief at the core of it. And in the Christianity itself, there are a lot of potentialities for libertarian anarchist movements, such as the Husserlites, who believed that tax was wrong, that every man was a prophet before God, and the levelers and the diggers, who wanted to live communally off the land, which they said belonged to everybody. So now, as well, what we're seeing happen in Russia is not just the rise of a new state, but there's a lot of ideas behind that. For instance, if people want to really know more, they can read about Alexander Dugin, which is called the Rasputin of Putin. Rasputin was the guy that was whispering in the ear of the Tsars. He didn't have any official power or position, but he was able to influence the Tsars through the power of his ideology. And Alexander Dugin is the state ideologist for Russia. He's written a lot of books, but one of his books is called Foundations of Geopolitics. It lays out a geopolitical plan for Russia over the next 20 years. And that book is required reading for every Russian military officer. He's written another book called Fourth Political Theory, in which he proposes a new ideology that can bring together all of the different strands of, for instance, he says that Russia need to preserve their communist roots while bringing back some of the tradition. So this is something now that is happening in Russia, where, for instance, in England now, everybody's really excited over this guy, Jeremy Corbyn. He's like the Bernie Sanders kind of a guy. And I had a lot of people coming to me and going, oh yeah, Jeremy Corbyn, oh yeah, did you hear his speech in Glastonbury? There's a guy that called himself socialist. It's a Glastonbury Music Festival. It cost £250 to enter. On average, people spend £2,000. And so this guy's giving a speech, and I watched the speech, and he goes, oh yeah, we're the lions, we can do it, yeah. Empty rhetoric. There's nothing in there. There's no vision about what he's creating. And everybody's like, yeah, woo, it's like a party, you know. To make a revolution is a hard work. It takes dedication and commitment. But why do we do it? Because we have a sense of ambition and long-term vision. And he's not saying anything new, Jeremy Corbyn. He's saying, oh, I'm going to raise the minimum wage. I'm going to give more welfare. I'm going to build more hospitals. In other words, vote for me, and I'm going to give you more free things. You don't have to do anything about it. Like all over England now, there's organizations of Jeremy Corbyn called Momentum, and I went to one of these meetings, and in the meeting, I was talking with the people. I was like, look, there is a group of homeless people in the park. If you want afterwards, I'll introduce you to them. And none of them were interested. Even I was talking to a woman, she's like, no, I'll go and watch the football. So in their mind, they want to just vote for somebody else who's going to fix the problem for them. That's the problem in the West now. West has become very soft and lazy. It's like I went to watch my friend the other day. He's like, oh yeah, do you want to go and watch a movie? I said, yeah, I'll go and watch a movie. He's like, what do you want to watch? I was like, Dunkirk. So I was very excited to go and see Dunkirk. I was like, yeah, we're going to watch a movie about fighting against the fascists, fighting against the Nazis. You know, the entire movie was about them trying to run away from the war. For someone who, my ancestors, fought against the Nazis, made that heroic struggle, that sacrifice, was a disgrace. This is the movie to tell people, run away home to your mum where it's comfortable and it's safe. When as a West, we're facing the rise of really dark forces. Everybody just want to recede into a bubble to feel comfortable. Meanwhile, when I hear Putin speak, he's really saying something. He's really saying, like, look, as a Russian, we have to work together to make something bigger. It's like, there's a video of Putin on the internet you can find called Putin when he goes to Chechnya. In Chechnya, where all of those things happen after so many years, Putin he's visiting Chechnya, and he says, he's in a dinner with a bunch of his generals, and he says, we've lost a lot of comrades here. A lot of our friends and family have fallen, and that's why I'd like to raise my glass to them. But we have a big task ahead of us, and there's a huge work that needs to be done. So that's why I'm going to put down my glass. I'm going to have a quick bite to eat, and then I'm going to get back to work. Wow. To see the leader of a nation talk like that, incredible. So that's what West is up against now. We have to realize Russia spend every year $60 billion on their military. America spend $600 billion on their military. Yet Russia has completely outplayed America in Central Asia, and they're winning in the Middle East. Western civilization is in a deep state of crisis. Finito.
There, you're finished.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you again for coming. There's some drinks outside. And of course, thanks again for the helpers, to Roger and to Lucas, who helped to make this event to happen, and of course, Lakeside Partners again. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Amir.